January 17, 1943. Wilhelmshaven, northern Germany. The winter sky hangs pale and brittle over the Frisian coast, a colorless dome stretched thin above the industrial sprawl of Germany's naval fortress. At 11:47 in the morning, Oberstfreiter Klaus Zimmermann stands behind his 88mm Flak gun, breath crystallizing in the frigid air. His hands, wrapped in wool that has worn through at the fingertips, rest on the cold metal of the elevation wheel. Around him, the anti-aircraft battery sprawls across the dockyards like a constellation of steel, 23 guns pointed skyward, their crews stamping feet against the frozen ground, waiting. The sound that reaches them first is not what they expect. It begins as a distant hum, low and sustained, like the rumble of approaching thunder on a cloudless day. Zimmermann tilts his head, listening. The sound grows, deepens, multiplies. It becomes not one engine but hundreds, a mechanical chorus that seems to emanate from the very fabric of the sky itself. He raises his binoculars, scanning the pale blue emptiness above. And then he sees them. At first, they appear as dark specks against the winter sun, geometric and deliberate. But as his eyes adjust, as his mind begins to process what his vision reports, the specks resolve into something unprecedented. Aircraft. Dozens of them. No, scores of them. Flying in formation so tight, so mathematically precise, that they seem not like individual machines but like a single organism, a great metallic creature moving with impossible coordination across the frozen dome of heaven. They are higher than anything Zimmermann has ever seen, higher than he believed bombers could fly. The contrails streaming behind them etch white lines across the stratosphere, parallel and unwavering, as if God himself has drawn them with a ruler. The Flak predictor operator shouts numbers, altitude readings that seem impossible. 9,000 meters. 30,000 feet. At this height, the air is so thin that men cannot breathe without oxygen. The temperature hovers at 40 degrees below zero. This is the realm of the stratosphere, where the curvature of the earth becomes visible, where human beings should not be able to sustain life, much less wage war. The 88mm guns begin to fire. The sharp crack of the cannon echoes across the dockyards, shells climbing toward the distant formations with spirals of smoke marking their ascent. Zimmermann watches through the optical sight as the black puffs of exploding flak appear in the sky, but they blossom thousands of feet below the bombers, harmless dark flowers blooming in empty air. The predictor operator frantically recalculates, adjusting for the unprecedented altitude. The guns elevate further, barrels pointing almost straight up, straining at their mechanical limits. Another salvo. The shells climb higher this time, but still the explosions appear beneath the formations, as if the bombers exist in some higher dimension beyond the reach of earthly weapons. And through it all, the formations do not waver. They do not scatter. They maintain their geometric precision with mechanical indifference, as if the desperate fury of the guns below is nothing more than a minor atmospheric disturbance. This is not how air war is supposed to be fought. This is not what Zimmermann and his comrades were trained to expect. For 2 years, the Luftwaffe has taught the world the doctrine of the bomber. From Warsaw to Rotterdam, from London to Belgrade, German aircraft have demonstrated that bombers are instruments of terror and destruction, but also of vulnerability. They fly in loose formations, rarely above 20,000 feet. They rely on fighter escorts for protection. They are mortal things, subject to the laws of aerial combat that German fighter pilots have mastered. When British bombers come at night, they come in darkness, scattered and vulnerable, picked apart by searchlights and night fighters. The Germans have learned to read the patterns of air war, to anticipate the weaknesses of enemy bombers, to exploit the fundamental truth that has governed aerial warfare since the first machine guns were mounted on aircraft. Fighters rule the sky. But the aircraft flying over Wilhelmshaven this January morning are something different. They are Boeing B-17 flying fortresses, products of American industrial philosophy and American strategic vision. Each one weighs 32 tons fully loaded, powered by 4 Wright Cyclone engines generating 1,200 horsepower each. But it is not their size or their power that makes them revolutionary. It is their ceiling, their ability to operate at altitudes where the air is too thin for conventional fighters to maneuver effectively, where anti-aircraft fire loses its accuracy, where the bomber becomes not a vulnerable target but a fortress in truth as well as name. The American doctrine is built on a principle that seems almost arrogant in its confidence, that heavily armed bombers, flying in mutually defensive formations at extreme altitude, can penetrate enemy airspace in daylight without fighter escort and strike precision targets with devastating accuracy. It is a theory that challenges everything the Luftwaffe has learned about aerial warfare. It is a theory that, until this moment, has existed only in American training manuals and strategic planning documents. Now, at 11:52 on a January morning over Wilhelmshaven, the theory is being tested in the crucible of reality. Klaus Zimmermann watches the formations pass overhead, his 88mm gun firing uselessly into the stratosphere. He has been trained to believe in German technological superiority, in the inevitable victory of German arms. But watching these American bombers fly beyond the reach of his weapons, beyond the reach of everything Germany has prepared to throw against them, he feels something shift in his understanding of the war. These are not the desperate, scattered night raiders of the RAF. These are not vulnerable targets fleeing through darkness. These are machines of war operating with a precision and at an altitude that suggests an industrial and technological capacity he has not imagined possible. The men flying in those formations are experiencing something equally unprecedented, though from a vastly different perspective. In the lead aircraft of the 91st Bomb Group, First Lieutenant Robert Morgan sits in the pilot seat of a B-17F, his oxygen mask pressed tight against his face, frost forming on the rubber where his breath escapes. Outside the cockpit windows, the world has become abstract. At 30,000 feet, the earth below is a pale geometric puzzle of fields and coastlines, distance rendering it toy-like and unreal. The air temperature outside is 42 degrees below zero. Ice crystals form on the windscreen, delicate fractals that momentarily obscure the view before the defroster clears them away. Morgan's hands rest on the control yoke with the light touch of a man who has learned to fly in the thin air of the stratosphere, where the margin between maximum and minimum speed narrows to almost nothing. Too slow, and the B-17 will stall, wings losing lift in air too thin to support its weight. Too fast, and the airframe will begin to shudder with the onset of compressibility, the strange and deadly aerodynamic forces that manifest at the edge of the sound barrier. He flies in a narrow corridor of speed and altitude, holding formation with the precision of a watchmaker, when long-range P-51 Mustang fighters begin escorting the bombers all the way to their targets and back, the equation shifts decisively. Now the formations fly not only at unprecedented altitude but under fighter cover that matches or exceeds the capability of German interceptors. The Luftwaffe, bled white by years of combat on multiple fronts, facing a chronic fuel shortage that limits training for replacement pilots, begins to lose the mathematical battle of attrition. For every American bomber destroyed, the Luftwaffe loses fighters and pilots it cannot replace. For every German fighter that falls, America builds 3 more bombers and trains 6 more pilots. There is an object that recurs in German accounts of facing the American bomber streams, the contrail. At altitudes above 25,000 feet, where water vapor from engine exhaust instantly freezes in the supercooled air, aircraft leave behind visible trails that persist for minutes, white lines drawn across the sky. The contrails become a signature of the high-altitude war, visible for miles, announcing the approach of American formations long before the bombers themselves come into view. German civilians, looking up from their cities and towns, learn to read the contrails, to count the parallel lines and estimate how many bombers are approaching, to track the formations across the sky and predict which city will burn today. The contrails are more than a meteorological phenomenon. They become a symbol of transparency and inevitability. The British raid at night, hidden by darkness, their approach masked until the bombs begin to fall. But the Americans announce their presence with white lines across the blue sky, flying in daylight as if daring Germany to stop them. There is something psychologically devastating about this transparency. The formations come in broad daylight, visible for miles, their intent obvious, their target predictable. And yet, for all that warning, for all that visibility, Germany cannot prevent the bombs from falling. The contrails become a daily reminder that the sky is no longer Germany's domain, that the stratosphere has become an American highway. Klaus Zimmermann, promoted to Wachtmeister by late 1944, watches the contrails etch their patterns across the sky with a fatalism that has replaced the confidence of 1943. His gun crew still fires, still tracks the formations with their optical predictors, still sends shells climbing toward the distant bombers. Sometimes they score hits, the anti-aircraft defenses are not useless, and the Americans pay in blood for every mission. But the fundamental equation has not changed. The bombers still fly at altitudes where flak is least effective, still maintain formations that maximize defensive firepower, still come in numbers that overwhelm the defenses. And when the war finally ends, when Germany lies in ruins and the thousand-year Reich has collapsed after 12 years, Zimmermann will remember those contrails. Remember the sense of helplessness that grew with each passing mission. Remember the moment when German technological supremacy revealed itself as illusion. The American crews who survived their tours, 25 missions, later raised to 35 as losses decrease and the strategic campaign intensifies, return to the United States with stories of combat at altitudes where human beings were never meant to fight. They speak of frostbite so severe that gunners lose fingers to the cold. They describe the thin air of the stratosphere where wounds bleed less because blood pressure drops, where hypoxia kills silently if oxygen equipment fails. They remember the contrails of crippled bombers spiraling down from formation, the parachutes opening like white flowers against the blue, the sudden absence where moments before a fortress flew. The strategic bombing campaign will be debated by historians for decades. Questions of effectiveness and morality, of whether the destruction justified the losses, of whether precision bombing from 30,000 feet achieved its strategic objectives. These are complex questions without simple answers. But what is undeniable is that the American doctrine of high-altitude formation bombing, tested first over Wilhelmshaven in January 1943, represented a fundamental shift in the nature of aerial warfare. It transformed bombers from vulnerable raiders into strategic weapons, demonstrated an industrial capacity that Germany could not match, and established American air power as a decisive factor in the war's outcome. April 1945. Klaus Zimmermann stands in the ruins of Berlin, his 88mm gun silent, its ammunition expended days ago. Above him, the sky is empty of contrails. The American bombers have moved on to targets in what remains of the Reich, or perhaps they have stopped flying altogether, their mission complete, their point proven. The war is over in all but its final formalities. Soviet artillery rumbles in the distance, closer each day. He thinks about the moment 2 years earlier when he first saw the American formations flying at 30,000 feet, contrails white against the winter sky. He remembers the confidence with which he manned his gun, the certainty that German arms would prevail. And he wonders if that moment, watching the bombs fall from an altitude his weapons could not reach, watching the formations maintain their geometric precision despite everything thrown against them, if that moment was when the war was truly lost, when the illusion of invincibility shattered against the reality of American industrial might. The contrails are gone now. The fortresses fly elsewhere, or perhaps they have landed for the final time, their missions complete. But their image remains, etched not just across the sky but across the consciousness of everyone who witnessed their passage. They were more than bombers. They were symbols of a different kind of warfare waged from the stratosphere by an enemy with resources unlimited, with industrial capacity beyond imagining, with a doctrine that transformed vulnerability into strength through the simple expedient of flying too high and in formations too disciplined to be scattered. In the end, it was not any single battle that determined the outcome. It was the accumulation of missions, the relentless repetition of formations appearing on the horizon, contrails announcing their approach, bombs falling despite everything Germany could do to stop them. It was the mathematics of attrition applied by an enemy who could afford the losses, who could replace every destroyed bomber with 3 more, who fought not with desperation but with the confidence of unlimited resources systematically applied. The sky is empty now, but Klaus Zimmermann still sees the contrails when he closes his eyes, still hears the drone of engines at an altitude where men should not be able to sustain life. The fortresses have passed into history, but their passage marked the boundary between one kind of war and another, between an era when Germany believed herself invincible and the moment when that belief died, 6 miles up in the frozen stratosphere, where American bombers flew beyond the reach of earthly weapons and proved that supremacy in the air, like supremacy in war, belongs not to those who believe themselves superior, but to those who possess the means to make their will manifest, even in the thin air at the edge of space where contrails draw their lines and bombers fly like gods beyond the reach of mortal fury.